We've heard the conversation described. Now Canadians get to listen for themselves about what was discussed between Jody Wilson-Raybould and former top bureaucrat Michael Wernick in a December phone call. 2 hours ago, that audio was released, along with documents containing emails and texts from Wilson-Raybould that she says bolsters her argument she faced consistent and sustained inappropriate pressure to intervene in the SNC-Lavalin criminal case. The CBC's Katie Simpson has been poring over those documents, listened to the full call, and she joins us now. Katie, thank you. Let's start out with what is there anything new here, basically? Because we did hear testimony from Jody Wilson-Raybould and Michael Wernick twice, in fact, on that December phone call. So what's new?
Well, what's important to remember here is that there's two aspects to this submission. So Jody Wilson-Raybould submitted 44 pages in documents, which includes a transcript of this phone call and that audio. Before we discuss the audio, and we will discuss that in just a moment, there are a couple of key things here that are new. She also shed new light on why exactly she decided to quit cabinet. She explains in greater detail that when she confronted the Prime Minister or had a conversation with the Prime Minister about the cabinet shuffle back in January. Remember, Scott Bryson had decided he was going to leave politics, and so they had to do a cabinet shuffle to make sure someone would be moved into the role of Treasury Board President. She expressed to Jerry Butts, as well as others, that first of all, she didn't understand why she had to be included in this shuffle, that she would not take Indigenous Services Minister, and she thought that that is something that the government would have already known given what she's done with her career. But the other aspect is that she agreed to take the role of Veterans Affairs Minister because she says she took Justin Trudeau at his word when he said she was not being shuffled because of the SNC-Lavalin affair, because she would not agree to step in, end the criminal prosecution in favor of a negotiated settlement for that company. She said she decided to take the Prime Minister at his word, but if the new Attorney General was going to grant a deferred prosecution agreement, that she would resign. However, we now learn, according to these documents that she presented, that she actually decided to resign from cabinet because of something Justin Trudeau said to reporters. Shortly after the story first broke in the Globe and Mail on February 7th, that she faced inappropriate pressure over this issue, Justin Trudeau was asked a series of questions by reporters, and he had given the response, well, you know, Jody Wilson-Raybould, it essentially said Jody Wilson-Raybould's presence in cabinet speaks for itself, whether she is comfortable with how the government has handled this whole affair. That was a tipping point. That was a line too far for Jody Wilson-Raybould, so the next day she decided to resign. The other issue she addresses here is that she recorded this conversation that we're going to play in a moment, but she recorded this conversation with Michael Wernick that happened on December 19th, and Canadians will remember she testified in great detail about this conversation with direct quotes, and she explains why she decided to take that move in part of her submissions, and we're going to bring up part of the quote now. It says, normally when I take an important call like this, I would often have a staff member with me to take notes, but in this case, I was alone in our condo. I was anxious to ensure that I had an exact record of what was discussed, as I had reason to believe that it was likely to be an inappropriate conversation. So while I typed out notes during the phone call, I took the extraordinary and otherwise inappropriate step of making an audio recording of the conversation without so advising the clerk. This is something that I have never done before this phone call and have not done since.
And so how does what we heard measure up? Again, I mean, in the testimony that she gave, she said that she felt that conversation contained veiled threats, right? She said that in the times that he invoked the Prime Minister's name, she interpreted that as veiled threats. How does this substantiate, I guess, what she said?
Well, she wants Canadians to make that decision now that this is publicly out there. This 17 minutes of the conversation between her and Michael Wernick, the clerk of the Privy Council. She, as you mentioned, she described this as veiled threats and inappropriate pressure. There is certainly nothing menacing within. There's no menacing tone in the conversation. And what it sounds like is it highlights a deeply ideological divide between the Prime Minister's messenger, Michael Wernick, who's delivering a message on behalf of the Prime Minister, and his then Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who is very firm, as she said in her testimony, that she had made up her mind about this issue and she did not think it appropriate to even have further conversations. Have a little listen to how that sort of unfolds.
All right. Well, I don't, I'm going to have to report back before he leaves. He's in a pretty firm frame of mind about this, though, so I'm a bit worried.
Bit worried about what?
idea for the Prime Minister and his Attorney General to be at loggerheads.
Well, I feel that I'm giving him my best advice, and if he doesn't accept that advice, then it's his prerogative to do what he wants. But I am trying to protect the Prime Minister from political interference, or perceived or otherwise.
Wilson-Raybould repeatedly makes the point that she's trying to protect the Prime Minister, that she doesn't want there to be any sort of perceived political interference in any kind of decision like this. Michael Wernick, it's important to point out, who A, did not know he was being recorded, B, also makes the point on a couple of occasions that the Prime Minister doesn't want to do anything inappropriate or anything that's outside the realm of what is available, illegal. And he's looking to seek information as to why this deferred prosecution agreement route isn't something that is necessarily up for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson with the latest on that call. Obviously, MPs from all parties are going to want to weigh in on this, and they join us now. Randy Boissonneau is an Alberta Liberal MP on the Justice Committee. He joins us from Edmonton. In Windsor, Tracy Ramsey is the NDP's international trade critic. And with me in studio, Pierre Poilievre is the Conservative finance critic. Hi to all three of you. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. Mr. Boissonneau, I have to start with you. Is there anything that you heard or saw today that makes you think that the Justice Committee or some other committee needs to look more deeply into this?
Well, Vashi, I think what the submission today confirms is what we already knew, that there was an erosion of trust here, that good working relationships had broken down, that there was a disagreement over the intensity of conversations that could happen related and surrounding the Attorney General on an issue related to remediation agreements. It also confirms that no unlawful activity took place, that colleagues were involved in lawful advocacy. It also confirms that, as we all know, that this case is proceeding to trial. And so really for me, it confirms what we already knew through 13 hours, or 10 witnesses, 13 hours, and 600 questions at the Justice Committee.
Mr. Poilievre, does it confirm what we already knew? Is there anything new in this?
It confirms that Jody Wilson-Raybould was telling the truth and the Prime Minister and his team were not. I give you one striking example. The Prime Minister said at a media availability on February 15th that if anybody, including the Attorney General, thought that anything inappropriate was happening, they should have said so, implying that she never did. Well, now we have tape-recorded conversations where she multiple times said that the interference was inappropriate, that she compared it to Richard Nixon's Saturday Night Massacre during the Watergate scandal. And in that recording, we have the Prime Minister's top bureaucratic official saying that he's reporting all of that back to Justin Trudeau in mere hours. So Trudeau knew that his Attorney General had raised concerns about his political interference in the SNC-Lavalin criminal trial, and yet he went out after that fact and claimed that she had never done so. He's going to have to explain why he told that falsehood.
Ms. Ramsey, what do you think?
Listen, everyone who is listening to this tape today knows that there was consistent and sustained pressure. And what Michael Wernick said about her experiencing the pressure, or Gerald Butt said about her experiencing that pressure differently, is on display today. 17 times in 17 minutes, the clerk of the Privy Council attempts to change her mind. She is so crystal clear about the fact that she views this as political interference. She views this as a danger to the Prime Minister. She's even warning the clerk about the Prime Minister, about what could happen to him, and that she's trying to look out for his best interests. And over again, we hear the clerk resorting to all sorts of different tactics and really not listening to her when she's being quite clear and saying quite clearly she feels that she's being pressured. She has made up her mind and she will not change her mind. And again, there are just these consistent attempts. So today, I think, really put to bed the he said, she said about what had happened between these two. Do you think, Ms. Ramsey, though, when you get to listen to the tone of this interview?
Do you think, Ms. Ramsey, though, that he was pressuring her, or was he raising what the Prime Minister had told him was the Prime Minister's concerns? I mean, was he really trying to change her mind?
Vashi, 17 times in 17 minutes. She couldn't be any clearer right from the beginning when she tells him that she had made up her mind, she had communicated that, the decision was done, and that she was viewing this as political interference. She was worried about the integrity of the Prime Minister, and 17 times he tries different ways. How many times did she say she's uncomfortable throughout that conversation? She's uncomfortable with him repeatedly trying to get her to change her mind. This is pressure. That's what pressure looks like. If the beginning of the conversation had ended with him saying, I understand, thank you for the call, we would be having a different conversation.
Well, he did at one point near the end say, I understand. Mr. Boissonneau, picking up on Mr. Poilievre's point, the Prime Minister had said many times when he was initially addressing this that, you know, if somebody had an issue with this, if they felt the pressure was inappropriate, they should have spoken to him. I mean, she is explicit about this in this call to Michael Wernick. Michael Wernick does say that he's going to talk to the Prime Minister after. I mean, does it present some holes in the Prime Minister's argument when you listen to this?
Well, let's talk about this call. This is a sitting Attorney General who, in her statement today, indicates that taping the Clerk of the Privy Council was inappropriate, and she did so anyway.
No.
I find that shocking and mystifying. It's in the statement, Pierre.
No, she
it
didn't
says
say
it
that.
was inappropriate,
You're wrong.
and I went ahead and did it anyway. It's in the statement. We all saw this 45 minutes ago when it went public. So here's the issue. The issue is she knows what she's reading into that tape.
Takeaway, Randy?
No. My takeaway is very clear on this. It was always her call. It was very clear that Mr. Wernick in that testimony said, look, it's your call, but we have some public policy issues that we want to solve here.
That doesn't answer the question about the fact that the Prime Minister had said if she had a problem, she had to say it. And in this call, and we can certainly debate the merits of recording that, but in this call, she does clearly say multiple times, I'm uncomfortable, this is inappropriate, the pressure, the conversations we've had are inappropriate.
Look, and that's a conversation that the Clerk and the Prime Minister can have subsequently, but the reality is there are a lot of steps that you can take as a sitting Minister of the Crown, that you can tell the Prime Minister directly that you're not comfortable with this before you secretly record the Clerk of the Privy Council. I find that shocking and egregious.
Mr. Poilievre, does he have a point there? I mean, are there ethical concerns around the fact that she recorded this and Mr. Wernick didn't appear to know?
She specifically explained why she had to resort to that. This was one of 20 different occasions when the Prime Minister and his team inappropriately pressured her.
Over 4 months.
If I can continue. And she had no one present to keep records of the conversation, so it was her only mechanism to prove what she was saying. It turns out it was a wise move because all of the denials that Team Trudeau have made to her claims have now been disproven. And had she not recorded it, all of the falsehoods that Team Trudeau told throughout this scandal would not have been exposed. Chief among them, when Trudeau looked 37 million Canadians in the eye and said she never raised any concern about his inappropriate.
She said he said she should have said directly.
She said that she should have raised it, and she did not. She should come forward, and no one did. That's what she said. Come forward. Now, furthermore, in this case, Wernick is clear. He's calling on behalf of the Prime Minister, and he's going to report back to the Prime Minister. She did warn him. He knew it, and yet he said the opposite to 37 million Canadians. On the issue of pressure, on 4 occasions in the call, Wernick tells the former Attorney General the Prime Minister is firm and that he foresees a, quote, collision if she does not.
But did it sound like a threat to you? You're absolutely right.
Yes,
that's what he said.
He said collision.
Yes.
Collision. That was his term.
Yeah.
Now, when
it's not good for them to be at loggerheads.
When someone calls you up and says you either do something
But he didn't
or
say
you will be, no, that if you do not change the course that you're on right now, you will be in a collision with your boss, that is a threat. She said there were veiled threats. We have audio evidence there were veiled threats. Everything she claimed in the testimony is backed up now by audio recordings in direct contradiction to what Trudeau has been telling us now for months.
Did you interpret that, Ms. Ramsey, as a threat? I mean, he was saying, you're right, Mr. Poilievre, he was saying this is, it's not good for the Attorney General and the Prime Minister to be at loggerheads. He didn't say, though, you're going, he said, it's not good to be on a collision, you're heading for a collision, but he didn't say you're for sure going to lose your job if you don't change course. He didn't say you have to change course. He just kept bringing it up over and over again.
And that's where I think they're veiled, right? This is where these threats are veiled. So it's clear, it sounds in that call like Mr. Wernick himself is quite worried about this mood that the Prime Minister's in and going back and having to tell him this. But he's repeatedly using this as a reason to bring it back up with her, talking about the fact that, well, the Prime Minister, is in a mood here. The Prime Minister really wants this done. This is important to him personally. That's pressure. And, there are some veiled threats in some of the comments that he made. There are veiled threats in what Mr. Chin said to her Chief of Staff. I mean, there are veiled threats throughout this that are coming from men to women, which is a whole other layer. But I want to say that the 6 weeks that this was studied at the Justice Committee did not do it any justice. This case is far from over, and that is why we need a full independent public inquiry now. This is still only within her order in council. She's still only speaking about this small period of time. We don't actually have the whole story, and the only way to get to it is an independent public inquiry at this point.
For viewers joining us right now, we're joined by 3 MPs from the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP. We're talking about some breaking news, some written testimony submitted to the Justice Committee from former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould, and in addition to that written testimony, a 17-minute audio recording of a call that took place back in December between herself and the now former clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick. I want to play just a quick bit of that clip, and then I'll go around another time. Let's listen in. This is when they were talking about whether or not, sort of the difference between being Attorney General and Justice Minister. Take a listen.
I mean, you're not just the Attorney General, you're the Minister of Justice in the Cabinet, and that you have context within which you exercise your roles and responsibilities. Like, I'm not seeing anything inappropriate here, but I mean, you're right. No, and the PM, I mean, I think people are talking past each other. I think the way he sees it and the advice he's getting is that you still have things that you can do that are not interference and are still very much lawful. So.
It's not that they're not lawful. The perception and what will happen is it will be deemed political interference from day one when people were talking about why are we entering into or putting a DPA regime in place. Everybody knows it was because of SNC. Whether that's true or not, that's what people think.
Mr. Boissonnault, there's a portion of this conversation where Jody Wilson-Raybould brings up this, what's known as Section 13, essentially the reasons the Director of Public Prosecution decided against pursuing a negotiated remediation agreement. She has seen that, and she said she passed it on to the Prime Minister's office. Is the Prime Minister, are people in the Prime Minister's office aware of the reasons that the Director of Public Prosecution decided not to pursue a remediation agreement?
Well, I think it's clear in what Ms. Wilson-Raybould said today that she saw the Section 13 and she thought that that was the end of it for her and she didn't need to proceed. And then there's some conversation back and forth as to who received that information inside the Prime Minister's office. But I think what we learned today is that it confirmed what we already knew, Vashi, that she wasn't directed to go to a DPA. The case is not going to a remediation agreement, it's going to trial. There was
unless David Lametti intervenes.
That's Mr. Lametti's decision to make. But the reality right now is that she wasn't directed. There was nothing that crossed the line of unlawfulness. These are intense conversations about jobs, about pensions, but also about looking at a new piece of law that hadn't been in place before. And I think it's very important for Canadians to understand that this is an intense series of conversations between the AG and colleagues to get this right for the first time, because we'd never, put that piece of Canadian law to use before.
I guess the reason I'm asking, though, Mr. Boissonnault, is because it stuck out to me, this idea that there is the DPP independently made a decision based on the law, right? Looked at the factors and said, here's why this remediation agreement under the law isn't worth pursuing. For whatever reason, the AG saw that's the Section 13, and said, okay, I agree with that assessment. And I'm wondering, when the Prime Minister decided and people in his office decided that they had to push other factors, that they had to consider other things, did they understand, did they know why the DPP made that decision independently? Did they really get what they would be intervening, what they would be deciding to take over, to overrule?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we don't get to see the Section 13. That's up to the Justice Minister. What I found interesting today and confirmed the fact that we learned at Justice Committee was the Privy Council office asked the Department of Justice for an opinion on remediation agreements in this particular case with SNC, and that file never left the Justice Department back to the Privy Council office. So again, it's back to a relationship breakdown, back to an erosion of trust, which we saw today by Ms. Wilson-Raybould secretly taping the clerk of the Privy Council. And clearly, we can do better, we can learn from this, and we can get on with the business of making lives of Canadians better.
Mr. Poilievre, if in fact Mr. Boissonnault and I imagine other members of the government are going to say, look, this is nothing new. This is essentially the two versions of the stories that we've heard before. What mechanism is the opposition looking for to further, I imagine you want more study of this, to keep looking at this. What mechanism is there to do that? Or will you be pursuing?
We need to reopen the Ethics Committee investigation so that we can call all the other witnesses who were part of this unprecedented effort to overturn the decision of an Attorney General and drop or shelve charges into a criminal case of a corporation. There are 11 officials that Jody Wilson-Raybould alleges brought inappropriate pressure on her to shelve the charges into SNC-Lavalin. We've only heard from 2 of them. We need to hear from the other 9 so that we can find out exactly what happened. Trudeau has now shut down 2 parliamentary investigations into his SNC-Lavalin corruption, and we need his members to go back to committee next week, reopen the investigation so that we can get to the bottom of this.
Ms. Ramsey, is there any, do you agree that there needs to be, the Justice Committee needs to look at this again? And is it ever going to arrive at a point, even if you interview those 11 people, where there is some version of the truth out there, where it isn't, you know what I mean? Like, is there actually, she says nothing illegal happened. In the conversation, Michael Wernick keeps saying, we don't want you to do anything illegal or improper. So at the end of the day, what would a committee, what would we be trying to ascertain?
This is about the integrity of the office of the Prime Minister and inappropriate pressure on an independent Attorney General. This is not about a breakdown in communications or some type of breach of trust, the Liberal spin that my colleague is trying to tell you. This is very serious, and we hear Ms. Wilson-Raybould in this document talk about the seriousness of this, talk about the fact that this is actually about our democracy. This is not just about someone not getting along. And in that conversation, there's so much clarity. There's so much clarity that comes from her in her stating her position firmly and very clearly, I think, for everyone to hear. I don't know how the Liberals can continue to say there's nothing to see here.
Well, what's the question you're wanting to answer? Was the pressure inappropriate?
Well, first of all, yes, was there inappropriate pressure? And the other thing is there were only 3 out of 11 people that came before the committee. We haven't heard from everyone. And to be honest, we have people at the highest levels in the Prime Minister's office who are making statements about, you know, this isn't about the law, this goes beyond that. Let's write op-eds to cover things. All of these things need to be uncovered for Canadians to be satisfied that the Prime Minister's office is acting independently and not in the interests of themselves and their party. That's what this is about. And also at the core of this is, as a parliamentarian, her having the right to tell her whole story, her whole truth. We still don't have that. We still are talking about a portion of what has happened here, and that is unacceptable. We deserve the whole truth, and I am hopeful that will happen at the Justice Committee, but listening to my colleague who sits on that committee with myself, it doesn't sound like Liberals have any interest in ever getting to the truth.
All right,
and that is so disappointing for Canadians.
I'm out of time, so I have to leave it there, but thank you all 3 of you for your time. Thanks to Randy Boissonnault, Pierre Poilievre, and Tracy Ramsey. A new bombshell has dropped in the SNC-Lavalin controversy just last hour. An audio recording of a conversation between former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould and top bureaucrat Michael Wernick was made public after Wilson-Raybould delivered that to the Justice Committee. It's part of new testimony that she did. The phone call lasts about 17 minutes, and in it, Wernick repeatedly says the Prime Minister is very firm on the matter of SNC-Lavalin, and Wilson-Raybould repeatedly refuses to interfere in the case. Let's take a listen to a portion of that call.
I know I have a tool under the Prosecution Act that I can use. I do not believe it is appropriate to use it in this case.
Okay. All right. I mean, then that's clear. Well, I mean, he's in a very firm mood about this. So.
Does he understand the gravity of what this potentially could mean? This is not just about saving jobs. This is about interfering with one of our fundamental institutions. This is like breaching a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. So we can.
I don't think he sees it as that. I mean,
well, then nobody's explaining that to him, Michael.
So what impact might this new evidence have? Jennifer Stewart is a crisis communication expert and president of Syntax Strategic. I'm sorry. Hi, Ms. Stewart. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming back. I appreciate your time. So let's start off with your first impression. You've listened to the call, as have I. This was just released about an hour ago now. What was your first impression, especially because the call she had already testified to, Mr. Wernick had already testified to? How does it measure up against what we had heard from them in those committee appearances?
It speaks to the power of the spoken word, right? There's nothing new here, but you hear the tone, you hear the intonation, you feel the pressure, and it really provides more credibility, I think, to her testimony. Nothing new. This was on paper, but so was Mr. Butts' testimony, right? And the scenario that there's two sides to every story and this was misinterpreted, really, I think there's a lot of holes plugged in that story today, given her intonation, her clarity on that call that she was inappropriately pressured and that this conversation needed to stop.
She did know it was being recorded and he didn't. Do you think that factors into, I guess, the way in which it can be interpreted?
I think it does, for sure, but I don't think it diminishes Wernick's pressure that he was, applying to her throughout the call. The fact that she said the pressure started in September and it was ongoing, it was mounting, she said it was inappropriate. I mean, she may have well been in her right to record it. I don't think Canadians are worried today about whether it was in her right to record the call. They're worried about what is the truth today, right? This has been going on for almost 2 months, and Canadians are being told, there's two sides to every story. People interpret things differently. Sure, that may be true, but when I listen to Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony, I'm on her side today.
How come?
Because it's very clear that she said to Michael Wernick, this is pressure. This conversation needs to stop. You even question why somebody in Wernick's position is having that conversation as a bureaucrat. And it's very clear that that's coming from the Prime Minister. And at a certain point, the conversation that, this is just lawful advocacy, there's nothing wrong here, sure, nothing illegal happened. But at a certain point, when the Attorney General says enough is enough and these conversations need to stop, she needs to be listened to.
He did point out that she's also the Minister of Justice, right? Because she did keep saying this is inappropriate, I've made my decision known. She talks a lot about protecting the independent nature of the prosecution, right? And he does say, though, like at one point it's almost happened. The conversation had happened enough, it sort of repeated itself to a certain degree that he says, it's not just you're not just the Attorney General, you're also the Minister of Justice.
I took that as he's pulling at straws, but wear this hat. There's another way to do this. Sure, you're saying that this isn't appropriate as the Attorney General, but you're also the Justice Minister. And, as we saw in her testimony, she was very composed. She's obviously a very skilled lawyer. She knew what she was doing in terms of her responses. She knew she was recording the call, but she also was extremely articulate and, maintained her integrity in her position that this would not look good for the government, that the perception would be that this was political interference.
How would you advise, I guess, the government to respond to this? I mean, we heard a sampling of it from Liberal MP Wendy Boissonneau, essentially repeating what he had said before and what others in the government have said before, that this is a tale of two stories and a tale of two interpretations, and there's nothing necessarily new here, and we still know that nothing, Mr. Wernick is explicit that the Prime Minister doesn't want anything illegal to happen here.
And that's fair. And I think, when Mr. Butts gave his testimony, I spoke on air about a quote he said. He said, when trust breaks down, people view things differently. And in his testimony, I found that to be very compelling. But today it's very clear that when she was the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice, she was very firm in her position. This wasn't an afterthought after she was shuffled, right? She wasn't this disdained minister who felt that this was a demotion and then came forward with this. So I think, crisis communications is getting to the story from the get-go, being authentic. It's not big PR dollars. It's not, a smoke screen of communications. And the Trudeau government has failed, saying when Trudeau came out at the initial press conference and said, I wish she would have come to me and put this on her. She did come to the top bureaucrat in the Canadian government. How could that not have been more clear?
Do you think it raises questions? I mean, she didn't. He said she should have come directly to me. It appears she didn't, but she did directly. I mean, that call is her over and over talking about that the pressure is inappropriate. This is inappropriate. I'm uncomfortable with this. Do you think that would have obviously gotten back, I imagine?
Of course
it's Michael
it would have.
Wernick, right, to the Prime Minister. Does it raise questions then about the types of decisions that were made after? Like, should it, for example, have come as a surprise if moving her from Veterans Affairs, she would right away ask, is this because of SNC? I mean, you listen to that conversation.
It raises the question, but I think more than anything, it lifts the curtain for Canadians, whether it's fully true or not, about how this government operates. And as we saw with Grassy Narrows this week, that was an elite event, $1,500 per ticket. Trudeau likely didn't think he was being filmed. I mean, I'm sure there was other reasons, but he was very aggressive with the protester. And this call for Canadians, from a communications perspective, also lifts that curtain. What are these conversations like? When you call the Attorney Attorney General and she perceives that as, political interference, what exactly happens? And I feel like the curtain behind the Liberal government has been lifted this week, which from a communications perspective is very hard to backtrack on.
Do you think he was aggressive? And I guess I ask, there's two ways to look at it: tone versus content of what he's saying, right? Because I listened to it, and based on her testimony and his testimony, I found him less aggressive than he was in his testimony, the tone at least. But I take the point that he kept, she would repeat herself and say, no, I believe in the independence of the prosecution, et cetera, and he would say, well, what about this? Well, what about
Firmly
this?
aggressive and a little passive aggressive, right? And saying Trudeau's made up his mind and we need to find a solution. So, no, he wasn't yelling at her by any means, but did he continue to push the point and find other ways to try to navigate the conversation to steer her opinion? Absolutely he did, and that was clear today.
Do you think that he made veiled threats, though?
I think he did make veiled threats. I think it's very difficult to listen to that conversation and not put yourself in the situation of Ms. Wilson-Raybould and say, how would you handle that conversation? And you would feel innate pressure that there is a directive from the Prime Minister's office to look for a deferred prosecution agreement. And she repeatedly, I think I heard somebody say 17 times, say it was inappropriate. So I would interpret that as a threat.
Let me go over a little of the reasons that she provided in this document about why she recorded the call. And I know you say that it's probably not of primary concern, but I think there are a lot of people who were, as you said in a previous interview, had made up their minds. They felt as though there was nothing illegal that happened here, and they're saying, why wouldn't you first? I think Mr. Boissonnault said, why wouldn't you first go to the Prime Minister, say that this has gone off the rails before recording a phone call? Right. She says, normally when I take an important call like this, I would often have a staff member with me to take notes, but in this case, I was alone in our condo. I was anxious to ensure that I had an exact record of what was discussed, as I had reason to believe that it was likely to be an inappropriate conversation. So while I typed out notes during the phone call, I took the extraordinary and otherwise inappropriate step of making an audio recording of the conversation without so advising the clerk. This is something that I have never done before, this phone call, and have not done since. Is that convincing?
I think it's convincing, and I think it's fair. I don't disagree that it's inappropriate. She should have told him that it was being recorded. And, this is all coming out of her playbook, if you're looking at this from a communications perspective. She's kind of letting this play out, and she clearly was navigating the conversation. Whether you're being recorded or not, I think you kind of do shift in how you present yourself. That's fair. That's how humans act. However, she should have disclosed the fact that she was recording the conversation, absolutely.
Okay, let me ask you again from a communications perspective. How does she remain in caucus?
I don't think she can. And if I put on kind of the Liberal government hat, I think it's fair to say that, there's a distrust amongst herself and her caucus colleagues. So how can they have conversations that are important to, the Canadian economy with her in the room?
Lots more to come on this, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Ms. Stewart. That's Jennifer Stewart, President of Syntax Strategic. Appreciate your time.
Thanks.
What does the audio tell us? Did Michael Wernick cross a line, or do these kinds of conversations happen among the Prime Minister's top aides and ministers? David McLaughlin, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and Finance Minister Jim Flaherty joins me now in studio. Hi, David. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming back. So we've checked in throughout this whole controversy. Let me ask you, Katie mentioned the tone of the conversation, and that it didn't seem overtly aggressive. I'm sorry, but we've had a lot of other people on the show say the tone may have been one thing, but the number of times that he invoked how firm the Prime Minister was, could you not think of jobs, et cetera, could be interpreted as pressure. What do you think?
Well, I think it could be interpreted as pressure. I don't think it was threatening, though. The role of the clerk is, in fact, he's secretary to the cabinet. So in the integrity of cabinet and good cabinet governance, including good relations between the Prime Minister, who is his minister, he's the deputy minister to the Prime Minister, and then all the other ministers in the cabinet. That's an important part of what a clerk's job is to help manage. So in that respect, him saying, look, the PM is of a certain view of this is actually quite helpful for a minister to know at least the kind of the political lay of the land. But in the course of this, it is very clear that he wouldn't take no for an answer. He kept, bringing this up forward to say, well, look, what about this? And could we, think about this maybe a certain way? And almost like he would say, look, this isn't, we're not saying we should do anything illegal, or we're not saying we're directing you to do it. Almost like once he had said that and boxed it and put it on the shelf with a nice ribbon and bow and put a light on it and a pedestal, then he could say whatever else he wanted. And she was clearly feeling this as pressure. At the end of the day, she was the decider. And so if she saying to herself, and then in fact saying to others, look, this is inappropriate. I've made my decision and I'm not going to interfere. There's nothing that anybody else can actually do. And she was taking what probably seemed to the clerk and obviously folks in the Prime Minister's office as a rather doctrinaire, rigid kind of interpretation of the role of the public prosecutor and what could or should be done by the Attorney General in this instance. Rigid or not, it was still her call. And she kept saying repeatedly, it is my call. And then what is really interesting in this, of course, is her saying, guys, I'm trying to protect you here. And
why do you think that was so interesting?
Well, I find it interesting because she was raising the political stakes for them. I mean, this was, if it wasn't a shot across the bow in the sense of saying, look, I'm going to go talk about this, it was a pretty clear indication that, guys, you're reading this wrong. This issue is really about political interference here. And I found it very insightful in terms of understanding this, that she said, she kind of intervened and tried to talk over Wernick to say, then you guys are advising him wrong, or you're not talking to him about this in the right way. And that sort of, to me at least, reinforces her take, as she has been putting out there, that she she said nobody broke the law, there's nothing illegal done, but why did she stay on, right? Why didn't you just resign? Well, it kind of looks more and more like she was staying on in part to make certain that somebody didn't do the wrong thing. But you clearly see they're talking past each other here.
Is that kind of conversation, quote unquote, normal in that kind of a circle for a clerk to talk to a minister, for that type of a conversation to play out?
Well, leaving aside the legal piece of this, because this is that part of the situation is a bit abnormal because of the obvious legal repercussions. But having a clerk talk to a minister and explaining the views of the Prime Minister, or explaining some broader context, and that is, in my view, totally normal and frankly is helpful to cabinet government.
In the way that he did?
Yeah, I think he came out and he said, look, I mean, he was the messenger, right? But he was drafted to do this, although he probably applied for the job, right? It's a good job. But he then said, look, the Prime Minister is in a certain, frame of mind. And he was really letting her know that the Prime Minister wasn't letting go of this. So in that sense, he conveyed the message. But what was really interesting and revealing that he and the others didn't pick up on is that didn't actually, melt her support. It actually reinforced her support.
And so what I sort of had the same impression. Should they not have better anticipated what was to come?
Well,
after shuffling her,
look, I mean,
when she first came out, when the Globe article came out,
Look, somebody's political antenna were really not working here. I mean, this, when you now look back on all this, you can actually, it almost seems preordained. But at the same time, what she came out today with her new documents and her new evidence almost reinforces what has already been said. There was some new stuff in there, but it basically reinforces that what she said on this was accurate. And you can almost see when people said, well, look, we didn't say to her, you have to do this.
Which she didn't in that conversation. Yeah.
And so therefore, they themselves also boxed themselves in and put themselves in that little box, put it up on a shelf and said, we're not doing anything wrong. But the ongoing part of this simply reinforced her perception that she was under pressure. And pressure is one thing, doing something illegal is something else. And so clearly there's pressure.
I guess I just think she was so explicit about how she felt, how she interpreted the actions henceforth, and then to think that shuffling her from that position would not be interpreted by her as something to do with SNC. Now, in hindsight, having listened to that conversation, to me seems almost bizarre.
Well, the role of the Prime Minister's office is to be the political arm of the Prime Minister and the government at large. If you don't do the politics right, if you can't be politically sensitive and aware of that, then you're really not doing your job. That's job number one. And frankly, they dropped the ball on that by all evidence, because you look at how this thing has unfolded. I mean, it's been 2 months. It's the longest political suicide note in Canadian history. If you look at it in terms of the changing script on this thing and how it's gone on, 2 months worth of this kind of back and forth on it. What happens today, I think, underlines very much that Ms. Wilson-Raybould is probably the strongest actor on this file in terms of her beliefs, or her being the more truthful one on it. Everybody is still responding to her. She's setting the narrative. And if you're a Prime Minister and a government and a party that is behind on a narrative like this, that goes to ethics, corruption, personal integrity, and you're 6 or 7 months away from an election, you better be finding ways to seize the initiative and the narrative back. I would venture, I mean, they haven't done that to date. This may be the very last opportunity. They've had previous opportunities.
What do they do now to do that?
Well, they really have to say, we were wrong. She was right. And find a way to say, we get this now. And because anything, and it's going to be incredibly hard. I get that. But they've dropped how many points? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 points. I mean, at some point you have to just look and say whether you believe it or not, politically you're in the wrong here on this, and you have to decide what you're trying to save.
What about the questions raised by her recording that call and Mr. Wernick not knowing that happened?
I think it's wrong. I mean, it just, you know, she herself calls it inappropriate. She took a call that she thought would be inappropriate. I mean, she had another avenue. You know, she had another option, as the, you know, the phrase goes. She could have said no, not taken the call. But having taken the call, I think it would have been better for everybody. She said, look, you know, I am going